Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Un secondo e poi iniziamo. Un paio di minuti e poi iniziamo. Sì. Buonasera a tutte e a tutti.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Carla Falloni. I'd like to welcome the scholars and the scholarship holders. I heard one of them comes from Brazil, so welcome everybody. We can now start the first session of this week, which will be very intense, the 72nd Settimana, with our first speaker, Hugh Houghton. He teaches New Testamental Scholarship at the University of Birmingham. He is director of the Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing in Birmingham. He was principal investigator of an important ERC project on the Pauline Epistula. He's co-editor of the Editio Critica Maior of the New Testament, and is responsible for the edition of the Pauline Epistulae, and he worked a lot on the edition of the New Testament in Latin. Today, his lecture will deal with a very important topic, which will introduce our week, entitled From the Vetus Latina to the Vulgate, Transition in the Manuscript of Latin Bible.
And I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak this afternoon. The Latin Bible is often described as having two distinct traditions: the Old Latin version, or Vetus Latina, which was replaced by the Vulgate from around the end of the 4th century. While there is some truth in this, the situation is in fact much more complicated with regard to the terminology, the underlying concepts, and the time scale. So in this paper, I'm going to examine the transition from the earliest forms of the Latin Bible to those typical of later tradition, with particular reference to surviving manuscripts from the 4th to the 9th century. First of all, some clarification should be made regarding the initial statement about the Old Latin and Vulgate. The number of early Latin translations which preceded the Vulgate is unclear. Writers in antiquity sometimes claim that each biblical codex was a different version. In the words of Jerome, there are almost as many Latin originals as there are manuscripts. More recent scholars have suggested that we should speak of veteres Latinae in the plural rather than vetus Latina. But work on the major edition of the Vetus Latina, begun in the middle of the 20th century, has established that for most biblical books, the surviving evidence stems from a single initial Latin translation, albeit one which was then revised in various ways on a number of occasions. For this reason, I will continue to use the phrase Vetus Latina in the singular. And in terms of the Vulgate, it's worth recalling that the phrase Vulgata editio was used by Augustine to indicate the older text, in contrast to Jerome's innovations. It was only in the 16th century, in the famous decree of the Council of Trent, describing the version associated with Jerome as Haec ipsa vetus et vulgata editio, that Vulgate took on its modern sense. And even though it's somewhat anachronistic, I will follow this later usage in order to distinguish between the Vetus Latina and the version which came to replace it. It's also worth noticing that the relationship of the Old Latin and Vulgate varies in different sections of the Bible. There is a clear disjunction between the two in most of the books of the Old Testament, because Jerome created a largely new translation with reference to a Hebrew text, which he characterized as Hebraica Veritas, Hebrew truth, rather than the Greek of the Septuagint, which was the basis of the earlier Latin version. In the case of the deuterocanonical books originally written in Greek, however, existing Latin forms continued to be incorporated into later manuscripts. Jerome's biblical labors began with the four Gospels around the year 382, yet this was not a new translation. In his letter to Pope Damasus, which is included as a preface in many Gospel books, Jerome describes his work as a light revision of the text. I directed my pen only to correct errors which seemed to change the sense, and allowed the rest to remain as it had been. Likewise, the other books of the New Testament are revisions of earlier Latin versions, rather than fresh translations. We will explore later on how these became part of the tradition, but they appear to be the work of one or more unknown revisers, rather than by Jerome himself. So the dates of Jerome's activity, spanning the last 2 decades of the 4th century and the first few years of the 5th century, can be established with relative confidence. Nevertheless, there are very few, if any, surviving Latin biblical manuscripts which were copied before these revisions. Of course, the age of a document is not necessarily a guide to the age of its text. If a late manuscript is an accurate transcription of a much earlier one, then it will transmit a form which was in circulation a considerable time beforehand. That is, in fact, true of a considerable proportion of the surviving Old Latin witnesses. Even so, the presentation of the text may reflect the later norms expected in the context in which the manuscript was produced. The highest number of Old Latin biblical codices which have been preserved are Gospel books. This is likely to reflect the proportions in which they were copied, and also the preeminent role of the Gospels in Christian practice, especially liturgy. Several of them are associated with particular figures and have been treated as relics. Possibly the earliest surviving Latin Gospel book is Codex Vercellensis, still kept in the chapter library in Vercelli, and claimed to be the work of the town's famous bishop, Eusebius. The dating to the latter part of the 4th century is paleographically plausible, even if it is impossible to verify the attribution. Yet the oldest Gospel text is that of Codex Bobiensis, which is more archaic in appearance. Its pages are roughly square, comparable to the earliest Greek biblical codices, and the books depicted on the 4th century sarcophagus in the Basilica of St. Ambrose in Milan. The text is written in a single block. There is limited punctuation, although spaces are used for breaks in sense. The only obvious paratextual elements in the extant portion are the titles at the beginning and end of each book, and the running titles across the top of each opening. This plain presentation is also seen in the few surviving manuscripts with a more or less consistent Old Latin textual affiliation in other parts of the Bible. Among these are the Constance fragments of the prophets and the Fleury palimpsest with portions of Acts, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation, both of which were copied in Italy in the 5th century. There are multiple other fragments from the same date and provenance, many of which are now palimpsests, with comparable layout. The use of 2 columns, which we've already seen in Codex Vercellensis, is present in several 5th century Old Latin Gospel books. One of these, largely recovered from fragments in bindings in St. Gallen, has been attributed to Rome in the early 5th century. Again, there is little in the way of paratextual material apart from the titles, and few abbreviations apart from the nomina sacra abbreviations. The structure of the text is marked by paragraphs, beginning with ekthesis, an enlarged letter projecting to the left, and each starting a new line with blank space left at the end of the line above. A further 5th century Gospel book with pages which are largely square in shape is Codex Corbeyensis. 2 features are particularly worthy of note in this document. In addition to the larger letters in ekthesis marking the beginning of sense units, the first letter of each column is also enlarged, even if it occurs in the middle of a word. This is an antique practice, also seen in manuscripts of classical works, and the copy of Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, which may have been produced in Hippo in his lifetime. The other feature is the presence of chapter numbers and titles, capitula and tituli. These are seen both in the text, where the number and first line of each chapter is written in red, and preceding each gospel, where a full listing of chapter summaries acts as a table of contents. My analysis of the biblical text of the capitula in John indicates that 8 of the 16 series attested in Latin tradition appear to derive from an Old Latin text. The creation of each set of biblical capitula took place in conjunction with a new edition of the biblical text, and it may be possible to connect some of these with the visions reflected in the text types constructed in the Vetus Latina edition of Old Latin biblical books. That these capitula are an ancient feature of Latin Gospels is shown by the affiliation of one type with the citations of Cyprian of Carthage from the early 3rd century. Other biblical books, including the prophets and the Acts of the Apostles, have a series of tituli which indicates their origin in a Donatist context in 4th century North Africa. On the other hand, neither the titles nor the numbers are found in all Old Latin manuscripts, which suggests that they were not considered an essential feature of biblical codices. Turning now to Jerome's revisions, we are fortunate to have a large proportion of a manuscript copied within a few decades of his revision of the Gospels, the majority of which has the shelf mark Codex Sangallensis 1395. As the beginning of the document is lost, we do not know what was originally present there. Nevertheless, Jerome's letter to Pope Damasus, which I quoted earlier, is commonly found as the first item in Vulgate Gospel books. And conveniently, it enumerates the three major changes which Jerome introduced alongside his textual emendations. First, he says that he revised the order of the Gospels to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, following Greek tradition. Most of the Old Latin codices that I've mentioned so far have the order Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, which is also seen in early Latin iconography, although other sequences are attested too. This change of order paved the way for the other two alterations, the initial inclusion of the Eusebian canon tables, which permit the identification of parallels between the Gospels, and the marginal numbers in the text, which identify each passage and its relevant canon. Now, each canon represents a different type of agreement. So Canon 1 shows agreements between all four Gospels, Canons 2 to 4, material shared by 3 of the 4 Gospels, Canons 5 to 6, passages restricted to 2 of the Gospels, so maybe just Mark and John, and then finally Canon 10 consists of the unique material in each Gospel. So this 5th century manuscript does indeed give the Gospels in what might be termed the standard sequence, and as we see in the margin, the Eusebian cross-reference numbers are included. Now, these are in 2 different inks, as Jerome describes. The number identifying the section, the passage, comes first in black, in the same color as the text. And underneath, in red, comes the number of the canon. Where this particular codex departs from Jerome's description is in the other numbers which are included underneath the canon number. And those give the number of the parallel passages in the other Gospels. So on this page, for example, the last set of figures in the column here give us the passage from Matthew, canon 1, showing it's something in all 4 Gospels, and then Mark, Luke, and John. The parallels can be seen there in the margin. Conversely, in the second column, so this one here, where we have Matthew and column 6, we only have a parallel passage from Mark, canon 6, the agreements shared between Matthew and Mark. Now, when the Eusebian apparatus is presented in this way, the initial set of canon tables giving you the concordance of which sections appear in which canon is actually unnecessary. So even in this very early Vulgate manuscript, which displays a large number of the readings which Jerome seems to have introduced when revising the gospel text, it differs from his description of what his archetypical Vulgate gospel manuscript looked like. It's possible, actually, that this manuscript may have lacked the canon tables because everything you need for the Eusebian apparatus to work is in the margin here. The 6th century Codex Brixianus is a purple gospel book which has the Gospels in the Old Latin order, but this treats the Eusebian apparatus in a different way. The individual sections are numbered in the margin again, but the parallel passages are listed in a series of arcades at the foot of each page. Each of the 4 Gospels has its own column, and when a parallel is present, the corresponding section number lines up with the relevant section on the present page. So this is the Eusebian apparatus without any canons at all, and indeed without the order of the Gospels which Jerome introduced. This system still works even if you have the order Matthew, John, Luke, Mark. And that sort of attestation might suggest that some form of the Eusebian apparatus had been incorporated into Old Latin tradition. But this is a comparatively late witness, and I think a more likely explanation is the very close connection between Codex Brixianus and Gothic biblical tradition mentioned in the preface at the beginning of this manuscript. And of course, Codex Argenteus, the best preserved Gothic manuscript, has an identical set of marginal numbers and arcades at the bottom of each page, matching this non-standard sequence of the Gospels. So I think this is a more plausible model for Codex Brixianus, whose origin also has been suggested to be Ravenna. Turning back to the Old Testament, there are several paratextual features which are connected with Jerome. One of them is the series of prefaces which he wrote, matching his letter to Damasus at the beginning of the Gospels. In one of these, the so-called Prologus Galeatus, the helmeted prologue to the Book of Kings, he establishes the Hebrew canon as consisting of 22 books. And he also specifies here that what in the Old Latin version and the Septuagint tradition is treated as 4 books of kingdoms should be split into 2 books of Samuel and 2 books of Kings. So the titles of these books thus serve to indicate whether their text is Old Latin or Vulgate. Similarly, in this prologue, Jerome indicates that he has reordered the 12 minor prophets to follow the Hebrew sequence. In the preface to his revision of the Septuagint Psalter, he explained how he followed Origen's model in adding critical marks, the asterisk and the obolus, to indicate material which is only found in either the Greek or the Hebrew. And finally, in the prologues to Isaiah and Ezekiel, Jerome describes how in the Old Testament he set out the prophetic books, along with the Psalms and the books of Solomon, in sense units, per cola et commata. So the inclusion of Jerome's prefaces, along with the titles, the sequence, and the layout of particular books, function as paratextual indicators alongside the distinctive text of his translation, his new translation from Hebrew into Latin. But it's well known that Jerome's version did not meet with immediate acceptance. Augustine relates how the congregation of a church at Oya in North Africa was provoked to riot on hearing a liturgical reading of Jonah, in which the prophet rested under some ivy, following Jerome's translation of the Hebrew, rather than the traditional gourd. And you find some gourds hanging in the earlier mosaics depicting Jonah. Now, although Augustine was concerned about the pastoral implications of the new version based on Hebrew, encouraging Jerome to undertake a revision of the more familiar Latin version of the Septuagint, he was much more positive about Jerome's Gospels, describing them as almost without fault, paene in omnibus nulla offensio est, when we compare them with the Greek Bible. I've shown how in the 3 decades after Augustine wrote this letter, in the year 403, he relied almost exclusively on Jerome's Gospels. That's seen in exegetical works, such as his comparison of the 4 evangelists, De Consensu Evangelistarum, and his commentary on John, the Tractatus in Johannis Evangelium, as well as the ever-increasing affiliation of his quotations made by memory to Jerome's revised text. But in Augustine's later writings, there are also indications that he used Jerome's translations from Hebrew for part of the Heptateuch and the historical books. In fact, Augustine is one of the earliest witnesses to Jerome's translation of Isaiah, citing it within 4 years of its completion. So notwithstanding the scholarly merit of Jerome's work and the implication, at least for the Gospels, that it was produced by papal commission, Pope Damasus, its eventual adoption and popularity may be due in no small part to Augustine's influential endorsement and use of this version. But for a considerable period of time, Old Latin biblical codices continued to be produced. We've already seen this in the surviving manuscripts and fragments from the 5th century, and this continues into the 6th century. The most extensive surviving Old Latin manuscript of the Heptateuch, the first 7 books of the Old Testament, is Codex Lugdunensis, copied in Lyon in the second half of the 6th century. The plain presentation of this document is comparable to the earlier Old Latin manuscripts we've already seen, with a square block of text that presumably reflects its exemplar. Manuscripts written in 3 columns are comparatively rare, and it may be significant that the 5th century Old Latin fragments of the prophets, which I showed you earlier, also have 3 columns to a page. The text, again, is divided into paragraphs with ekthesis, the capital letters, marking the beginning of the section. But apart from occasional intermediate spaces, there's little in the way of word division or punctuation. The only abbreviations are the nomina sacra. There are no chapter numbers or titles present, although the first line of a new section and the first 2 lines of each book are written in red ink rubrication. The paratextual elements appear to be restricted, again, to the titles at the beginning and end of each book and the running title in the top margin. Now, roughly contemporary with this, and similar in terms of its presentation and paratext, is the Gospel book known as Codex Monacensis, or occasionally Codex Valerianus. There's greater use of colour and even plant and bird images at significant breaks in the text. But this Gospel book has none of the Eusebian apparatus, no numbered divisions, no prefatory material. The Gospels are, or at least originally, were in the Old Latin order, but there was a later attempt to rebind them in a different sequence. Although the text is generally Old Latin, there does appear to be some influence from the Vulgate, as well as evidence of further revision through comparison with the Greek source. There are certain renderings or formulations which are only present in this witness. At the same time, Vulgate Gospel books from the same period show several differences from the earlier models and from each other, reflecting a tradition which is in flux. The Burchard Gospels, copied in Rome or Campania in the latter half of the 6th century, contain initial canon tables with coloured bird and plant decorations comparable to those of Codex Monacensis. These are followed by Jerome's preface to the Gospels, beginning Novum Opus, and then a second extract from Jerome, the preface to his commentary on Matthew, which begins Plures Fuisse. After this comes a Latin translation of Eusebius' letter to Carpianus, in which he explains his canon system, that begins Ammonius Quidem, and then there's a series of chapter titles for all 4 Gospels. Then in addition, there's a separate preface before each of Mark, Luke, and John. So in this 6th century Gospel book, the amount of prefatory material has increased considerably, supplementing Jerome's items with other writings which were in circulation earlier. In contrast, the contemporary Codex Foro-Iuliensis, also known as the Cividale Gospels, has Jerome's preface to the Gospels, but no canon tables, and, surprisingly, no Eusebian apparatus at all in the body of the text. Instead, each Gospel is preceded by 2 different sets of chapter titles. The second is unique to this manuscript, but does preserve some Old Latin readings, suggesting that they derive not specifically from this manuscript, but from an older source. There are no images or decorations in this book at all. In contrast, the Gospels of St. Augustine are famous for their full-colour illustration of the evangelist Luke, surrounded by scenes depicting episodes unique to this Gospel, which makes them the oldest surviving illustrated Latin Gospel book. This codex is considered typical of those produced in conjunction with the missionary activity of Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century. Although the first 2 quires are missing, which are likely to have contained Jerome's preface and maybe also a set of canon tables, each Gospel here is preceded by a single set of chapter titles. The numbering system for these divisions is integrated into the text alongside the Eusebian apparatus, and both the Gospels of St. Augustine and the Burchard Gospels have the fuller form of the marginal apparatus, matching Codex Angelensis 1395. So these additional section numbers are present underneath the canon numbers, even though the initial tables are also present. These 3 more recent Gospel books, though, do share one innovation in contrast to that earlier copy of the Vulgate Gospels, and this is the much more granular division of the text. So whereas Codex Angelensis 1395, like the 4th and 5th century Old Latin manuscripts, divides the material into paragraphs marked by ekthesis, the basic textual units in these later manuscripts are much shorter. While it's still possible to identify paragraph-level sections marked by the larger initials, which project further into the margin, below that, a further set of indentations then sets off the text within each clause. So these short sense lines appear to be comparable to the per colla et commata sense lines introduced by Jerome's into the prophetic books of the Old Testament. Now, because Jerome makes explicit statements about this layout in his prefaces to those books, it therefore seems exceedingly unlikely that Jerome introduced this layout into other biblical books. Yet, by the late 6th century, we see that this presentation, which comes to typify the whole Latin Bible, had been extended to the Gospels. It's also worth noting that in all three of these 6th century manuscripts, the biblical text is less faithful to Jerome's division than in the Codex Sangallensis 1395. The Burchard Gospels are particularly noticeable for a heavy sprinkling of Old Latin readings, many of which were corrected by a later user. Yet this early and this persistent textual mixture, textual corruption perhaps, is a feature of Vulgate tradition. Old Latin texts continued to be copied from the 7th to the 9th centuries, albeit in decreasing proportions as the Vulgate forms became standard. Many of the witnesses from this period are mixed texts combining elements of both. The standard form of textual mixture takes the form of sporadic variant readings, either introduced by copyists more familiar with a different form of text, or perhaps overlooked during a process of revision, which left fossils from an early form into the text, even though the rest of the readings were corrected towards the Vulgate. So for this unsealed gospel book, produced in Brittany around the year 800, the process of correction can be seen going on in the opening pages of Matthew. And you can see readings crossed out and replaced with the standard Vulgate form. Now, although this manuscript has the Vulgate sequence of the Gospels, there are no initial prefaces, there's no Eusebian apparatus, so that suggests that this manuscript descends from Old Latin tradition, and its text has gradually been brought into harmony with the Vulgate through a layer of correction after correction after correction. And indeed, the alterations we still see introduced by a corrector on the first 8 folios show how an attempt was made to bring the text into line with the Vulgate. But even over the process of several such layers of revision, it's possible that some of the earlier forms were overlooked and persisted in subsequent copies. And in fact, this manuscript appears to derive from 2 different exemplars, which mean that not only do we see this sort of textual mixture, we also see the form of textual mixture known as block mixture. Portions of the text have a completely Old Latin affiliation, while others match the Vulgate. So perhaps the main source was an old but damaged document which was of particular significance to the community, and yet another manuscript was used to supply pages which were missing, or occasionally pages which were overlooked. And in my textual analysis of this document, I've shown there are several long omissions and several purely Old Latin sections which all have approximately the same number of characters, or a multiple of that figure, which would correspond to the amount of text on 1 or more pages missing from the exemplar. So, just for example, there's a passage in Luke 11 which is missing. It's about 2,000 letters compared with the Vulgate, and that's the same length as omitted portions of text in Luke 9 and Luke 20, or Old Latin sections elsewhere. So the exemplar probably had about 2,000 characters to a page. And this is not unique by any means. There are several other manuscripts whose textual affiliation changes from Vulgate to Old Latin for a single page or a single passage, demonstrating that different texts continue to be in circulation and were used to supply missing portions, apparently without consideration for the overall consistency. Another example of a hybrid later gospel book is Codex Laetigeranus, produced in Aquileia in the first half of the 8th century. Now here we have the 4 Gospels in the Vulgate sequence, along with prologues and lists of chapter titles. So far, so typical of Jerome's division. It's not clear, though, whether Jerome's preface was originally present, because again, at the beginning, there are missing pages. But we can be fairly certain that there were no canon tables, because this is another of those manuscripts which has, instead of the canon tables at the beginning, a set of arcades at the bottom of each page, which permit immediate reference to the matching sections in the other Gospels. These are comparable to the ones we noticed above in Codex Lxxianus and Codex Argenteus, which were produced over the century earlier. So perhaps this way of treating the Eusebian material in arcades was a tradition which persisted for some time in northeast Italy. But where this manuscript differs from Codex Lxxianus and the other manuscripts with arcades is that the order here follows the Vulgate sequence: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's not that this has been taken over from Old Latin, even though there are occasional Old Latin readings still in the biblical text. We have the arcades, but the arcades are applied to a gospel book with the Gospels in the sequence typical of the Vulgate. The Old Latin text of this manuscript is more marked in Luke and John than in Matthew and Mark. It may be that a corrector changed the text in Matthew and Mark to match the Vulgate and then lost interest, like Jerome originally himself did, as they went through. So we have more Old Latin readings towards the end of the manuscript in this particular document. There are also many detailed corrections. I didn't pick a page with corrections, but Codex Laetigeranus has been rebound, and there are little extra slips where the binder has cut round, leaving space for the tiny corrections added in. Now, several of the later Gospel books with a mixed textual affiliation were produced in Ireland. Their format often resembles Old Latin codices, copied in 1 or 2 columns of continuous text. But apart from the oldest, it's this one, Codex Ocelianus Primus, copied perhaps around the year 600, Irish Gospel books all follow the Vulgate sequence of Gospels. Most of them lack Jerome's prefaces and canon tables, and only a few of them have marginal Eusebian apparatus. So it seems that despite successive attempts to revise the text of the Gospels towards the Vulgate, in Ireland, the Old Latin version, which arrived, we might speculate, arrived early with St. Patrick, was particularly persistent on the borders, the outer edges of the church. The eventual predominance of the Vulgate appears to have been achieved through the development of pandects, manuscripts of the entire Bible in 1 or more volumes, which brought together all of the texts associated with Jerome. A key piece of evidence in this regard is Codex Sangiovannensis, a 2-volume Bible copied in Paris around the year 810. At the end of the canonical Old Testament, there's a note in majuscule script, which I reproduce here, alternating lines of red and black, noting that these are the books which the presbyter Jerome translated from the Hebrew truth, Hebrea Veritas, into the Latin language. And it continues, with the greatest eagerness and greatest concern, I sought out editions trailing through various manuscripts. I gathered them into one body, poured them across in writing, and made a pandect. Likewise, after the letter to the Hebrews, there's a further note that this is the library of Jerome, Bibliotheca. Jerome, the priest of Bethlehem, according to the Greek, brought together from the most corrected copies. Now that would be a remarkable achievement even in the 9th century when this manuscript was copied. But this document is clearly a copy of a much older one. Pierre Maurice Bogard suggests that the exemplar for this was created in the 5th century, within decades of Jerome's work, although Bonifatius Fischer prefers an origin in North Italy in the 7th century. In any case, the activity of this anonymous editor is remarkable. Not only are the biblical books transcribed and brought into order, but many of the writings are provided with short prefaces. The consistency of the presentation across hundreds of pages serves to fix the canon and to attach the name of Jerome to all the versions contained therein. There are still many peculiar and fascinating aspects of this volume which deserve further investigation. For instance, matching the apocryphal books at the end of the Old Testament. After the New Testament, the Shepherd of Hermas is included as well. The Gospel of John in this document contains in its margin sortes sanctorum, known in Greek as hermenei, used for divination, fortune-telling, and throughout the margin there are various exegetical notes using Tironian abbreviations. Surprisingly, despite featuring Jerome's preface, initial canon tables, and the marginal Eusebian apparatus, in Matthew the text is Old Latin, so we have block mixture with a book, an entire book is Old Latin, even though the rest of the New Testament is Vulgate in its textual affiliation. It's possible that block mixture was in the source used by the editor, the compiler, whereas elsewhere in the New Testament, this is one of the best Vulgate manuscripts. Another early and unusual Latin biblical compilation is the copy of the New Testament produced for Victor of Capua in the year 546, known as Codex Fuldensis. This famously has a gospel harmony in place of the four canonical gospels. So not four gospels, but one bringing together elements of each of them. Except that this uses Jerome's text. So even if the order of the passages is taken from an earlier harmony, such as Tatian's Diatessaron, each of the text of those passages has been brought into conformity with the Vulgate, as Victor describes in the preface. The rest of this manuscript, consisting of the Pauline epistles, followed by the Acts of the Apostles, the Catholic letters, and Revelation, again is an excellent witness to the text of the Vulgate. And what's particularly striking here is that the way in which these books, whose text was not revised by Jerome, have been brought into a similar presentation with the Gospels. The Pauline epistles are preceded by a prologue, beginning with the words primum quaeritur, which appears to have been composed by the reviser of the text, which became part of the Vulgate tradition. Its initial question, quaeritur, asks why the apostles sent these letters after the Gospels, and that might be the reason for the placing of the Pauline corpus immediately after the Gospels in this manuscript. This preface to all of the epistles is followed by a longer preface to Romans and a thematic concordance to the epistles based on numbered subsections corresponding to the capitular divisions within the Pauline corpus. So that resembles the Eusebian apparatus. Again, each epistle is preceded by a brief preface and a list of the capitular titles. The prefatory material to Acts consists of a list of places, a preface, and capitula. The Catholic epistles, too, have a preface, non ita ordo est, which, like Jerome's letter to Damasus, explains how the reviser for the Vulgate version reordered this corpus to match Greek tradition, unlike the Old Latin tradition, which had the letter of Peter in first position rather than the letter of James. Again, each letter is preceded by a list of its capitula, and this same sequence of prologue and capitula is also seen before the book of Revelation. So in short, whatever the origin of the Vulgate text of the New Testament outside of the Gospels, the standardized presentation of these writings brings it into a unified whole between the two covers of a single book, a single pandect. And that's particularly emphasized by the final page of Codex Fuldensis, which contains a short poem ascribed to Pope Damasus of Rome, to whom Jerome dedicated the revision of the Gospels, bringing it all into a unity. The person with whom biblical pandects are most closely associated in Latin tradition, however, is Victor's contemporary Cassiodorus. In his monastery in Vivarium, in the middle of the 6th century, he oversaw the production of 3 complete Bibles. One was a single volume, with all the canonical books arranged per cola et commata, which Cassiodorus explicitly states that he extended to the rest of the Bible from Jerome's practice. Another was in larger format with illustrations, the Codex Grandior, while the third was a Bible in 9 volumes. Now, the books in the illustration of the scribe Ezra in Codex Amiatinus have been connected with these 3 Bibles. At the feet of the copyist, there's a smaller book. Then on his lap, there's the larger one, perhaps the Codex Grandior, while in the bookshelf, the 9 codices have on their spines the titles which correspond to Cassiodorus' division of the books of the Old and New Testament. And Cassiodorus also mentions that he was responsible for placing lists of chapter titles at the beginning of certain books, and even composed his own when there were no chapter titles present in his exemplar. He too refers to seeking out the best texts, collating manuscripts against older copies in order to establish the correct reading, although there continues to be a disagreement as to whether all 3 of the Bibles had a Vulgate text, or whether some of Cassiodorus' Bibles continued to have Old Latin elements. And Cassiodorus' Codex Grandior appears to have been the inspiration for Codex Amiatinus, the great Latin pandect created at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow in Northumbria in the first decade of the 8th century. Although it took as its model an existing pandect, the creation of Codex Amiatinus involved a fresh assembly of books. Bede, a monk of the monastery at this time, specifically states that Codex Amiatinus and its 2 sister copies contained the new translation in contrast to the model they had, the pandect model, which had the old translation, having been brought by the abbot Ceolfrith from Rome. And the textual variety between the different sections of the Bible in this manuscript confirms the diversity of its sources. Even so, there is still a unity to the presentation. Each book is preceded by a prologue, some of which are explicitly attributed to Jerome by name. There's usually a series of chapter titles corresponding to numbered and rubricated sections within the text itself. As in Codex Fuldensis, again, put together separately, we have the Primum Quaeritur prologue, standing at the head of the Pauline epistles, although in Codex Amiatinus there's no preface to the Catholic epistles. The hierarchy of scripts, you can see how they vary for the titles and the prefaces and the section headings. There is a uniformity in everything here. And yet, despite the magnificence of the presentation and the considerable textual value of this witness to later scholarship as one of the best, one of the most important witnesses to the Vulgate, there's little evidence that Codex Amiatinus, or either of its 2 sister sibling copies, served as a model for subsequent productions. But their situation within Cassiodorus' discourse of the Old and the New translations makes it clear that by the beginning of the 8th century, the texts and paratexts of the Latin Bible, which had come to be associated with Jerome, were sought out by copyists for the production of a single unified volume. And what might be seen as the final stage to the transition to the Vulgate as standard took place at the end of the 8th century. Up to this point, the surviving pandects are the work of enterprising individuals, such as the anonymous 5th century compiler of Jerome, the scholar Cassiodorus, and ecclesiastical dignitaries such as Victor of Capua or Ceolfrith. But with the rise of Charlemagne, the production of biblical manuscripts became part of the apparatus of political power. Alcuin, Albinus, abbot of Tours, was charged with the correction of the text of the Old and New Testament, which was then presented to the emperor as a pandect in the year 800. No fewer than 46 complete Bibles and 18 gospel books survive, which were copied at Tours in the first half of the 9th century. And again, although they are not all textually identical, there is a uniformity in their presentation in terms of the prologues, titles, and chapter divisions for each book, the hierarchy of scripts in which the different elements of the manuscript is written. And notwithstanding several attempts to amend or improve the text, these Tours Bibles stand at the head of medieval Bible production through to the arrival of printing. There are the few instances of Old Latin texts persisting in manuscripts as late as the 12th or 13th century, but these are isolated anomalies. Their appearance is a curiosity. This is the point at which we have a standard presentation. So in conclusion, there's a continuity in the tradition of the Latin Bible which transcends a simple binary division into Old Latin and Vulgate. And that's true both on the level of text and paratext. Not only did different forms of text circulate alongside each other for over 3 centuries, but during that time, elements such as prefaces and chapter titles developed in one context were interpolated into another. And one of the more striking aspects of this study has been the difficulty of identifying an authentic manuscript of the Vulgate. Even in the Codex Angolensis, the Eusebian apparatus differs from its description by Jerome. So the creation of Pandex involved combining these books from different origins, attributing them all to Jerome in an attempt to attain this artificial unity. The adoption of sense lines, often attributed to the Vulgate, stems from this extension of a practice which Jerome introduced into a handful of books. So I think the concept of Vulgate is as elusive as trying to define Old Latin predicated on opposition to the Vulgate. Instead, we have a tradition of the Latin Bible which is as pluriform and as varied as the tradition of the Bible in its original languages, each reflecting different points and positions in the history of the communities responsible for its production and its transmission. Thank you.
Very much for this fascinating presentation. Thank you, Hugh. Grazie davvero per aver...
So thank you so much for showing this very complex, illustrating this very complex tradition, the tradition of the Vetus Latina and Vulgata. So thank you for focusing your attention on paratextual elements, which are highlighted over also in the latest studies because they are important elements from a critical and textual point of view, as we know. So now I will give the floor to Klaus Wachtel, a great author in the New Testament studies. He worked at the Institute of in Münster, where he also dealt with the critical apparatus of Nestland. Is a co-editor of the Editio Critica Mayer, and his studies focused on the textual Byzantine text by proposing innovative views on the development of this type of text. His lecture is entitled The Byzantine Text.
And I feel honored to be able to speak about the Byzantine text of the Bible as a New Testament scholar before such an esteemed audience. Thank you. So, the Byzantine text of the Bible. According to a well-known legend, Constantine's victory over his co-emperor Licinius in 324 occurred under the banner of the cross. His triumph also represented the victory of Christianity over the cult of Sol Invictus and other mystery religions. It took several decades until Christianity became the state religion in 380 under Theodosius. Still, to the present day, an icon showing Constantine and his mother Helena is found in almost every Orthodox church, reminding the believers of the bond of the empire with Christianity. Consequently, to meet a growing demand, Constantine himself commissioned Eusebius of Caesarea in 331, quote, to order 50 copies of the sacred scriptures to be written on prepared parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form by professional transcribers, thoroughly practiced in their art, end quote. Constantine's commission marks the beginning of the history of the Byzantine text of the Greek Bible, or rather, the point in time when the textual history of the Greek Bible became Byzantine. Those acquainted with New Testament textual research may be taken aback by using the term Byzantine text in this broad sense. In New Testament textual scholarship, the Byzantine text is usually equated with the Koine, that is, the text form that is nigh identically preserved in several thousand manuscripts and reproduced by Erasmus' first printed edition in 1516. As Textus Receptus, this text form represented the Graeca Veritas of the New Testament up to the end of the 19th century. Then the Anglican theologians Westcott and Hort published a critical edition that followed the oldest textual witnesses, which led to replacing the Textus Receptus with editions based on early witnesses in Western scholarship and service. The Byzantine text was identified with the late majority text. This conceptual constriction is hindering, however, if we try to outline the Byzantine text history of the whole Bible, which is characterized by multiple translations and text forms, recensions, and revisions. In the West, the early Middle Ages are usually seen to begin with the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 and to end about 1050 or later. The Byzantine Empire persisted in institutions inherited from antiquity until the 7th, 8th century, when the Arab conquest terminated the political order of the Mediterranean world. The Byzantine Empire was confined to Asia Minor, having lost North Africa, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia to the Arabs. At the same time, the Balkan territories were overwhelmed by the incursion of Avars, Bulgarians, and Slavs. In addition, the iconoclastic period, 726 to 843, brought about internal conflicts and several outbreaks of civil war. The end of the iconoclastic controversy marks the beginning of an era that the French Byzantinist Paul Lemerle called the first Byzantine humanism. Lemerle warns us against identifying the preceding Dark Ages with iconoclasm. Still, it is a fact that after centuries, from which only very few manuscripts survived, we see a thriving literary culture after the victory of the venerators of icons, the iconodules. This victory opened up the Middle Byzantine period, which also was a time of reconquest and consolidation of the empire. In this era, the Byzantine Bible achieved a stable form through efficient editing and copying routines developed in the 8th and 9th centuries during and after the iconoclastic controversy. It is still a central question in Septuagint and New Testament textual research how the multiformity in early phases gave way to the uniformity of the late tradition. One theory, supported through the 20th century by Septuagint and New Testament scholars alike, conveys that in the 3rd century, 3 major recensions were done that competed against each other until finally the Byzantine Koine prevailed. The other approach is developmental and tries to explain the standardization by tendencies inherent to manuscript transmission and to the influence of external factors, including recensional or editorial activities. The Byzantine Bible as book appearance and partition. Paul Magdaleno and Robert Nelson, in their introduction to the Old Testament in Byzantium, point out that the unification of the Old and the New Testament in one Bible reflects a fundamental theological claim. The sacred scriptures of the Jews were joined to the Gospels and other canonical Christian writings as a prelude to and prefiguration of the Gospel story. The central message behind this unification was that Christ had made obsolete the old covenant between God and Israel. Christendom had become the new people of God, and Byzantium was the new Israel. The formation of the Christian Bible evidences this process. One clue to this statement is Emperor Constantine's commission of 50 complete Bibles to Eusebius of Caesarea. The most popular Greek Bible codices, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, are such complete Bibles. It is possible that the two former were part of Eusebius' delivery to Constantinople. However, if we see Constantine's commission as starting the production of the Byzantine Bible, this does not refer to the appearance of the scriptures. Pandects, codices comprising the entire Greek Bible, are rare. The result of a recent thorough count is 5 such codices in majuscules and 5 in minuscules. The reason simply is that these large codices do not have a convenient portable form as Constantine requested. An opening of Codex Sinaiticus measures nearly a meter, and it was cumbersome to find the passage to be read at a service. The common format of the Greek Old Testament texts was the Psalter and the Prophetologion, the Old Testament lectionary. It contains only a small selection of Old Testament passages to be read in the service. What we call the New Testament was also most commonly available in lectionaries, comprising the Gospels and the Prax Apostolos, the Acts of the Apostles, the Catholic and the Pauline letters. The same subcollections are also typical of full-text manuscripts of the New Testament. Old Testament full-text manuscripts usually comprise subcollections like the Pentateuch, the Octateuch, sometimes combined with the historical books, the 12 and the 4 prophets, and most frequently the Psalms and the Odes were copied separately. Thus, the Byzantinist James Miller says in his contribution to the Old Testament in Byzantium that, quote, not only was the Bible as a whole a largely unknown entity in Byzantium, but likewise the parts, especially the Old Testament, were largely unknown entities as well, end quote. The large number of continuous text Old and New Testament manuscripts relativize Miller's statement. The Göttingen manuscript catalogue lists more than 1,600 such items. The list of manuscripts in the New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room has about 3,200 entries. There was a sizable demand for continuous text manuscripts in monasteries and theological schools. On the other hand, the texts read in the services indeed exerted a broader influence on society as a whole. The lectionary traditions originated in the 8th century in a phase in which the iconoclastic controversy was still ongoing. As Miller states, they witness a need for reform and uniformity in liturgical practice. Regarding the Prophetologion, the effort was successful. From the 9th century, the manuscripts evidence a consistent, stable textual tradition. The same is generally assumed for the New Testament lectionary. It is true, however, that the lectionary traditions have not been as thoroughly analyzed as the continuous texts. The Prophetologion has been published in an excellent critical edition by Höeck, Zunz, and Engberg. It was not their aim to establish the original text of the Septuagint, but to document the typical text of a Constantinople prophetologion of the 11th century, with its characteristic variants. Zunz states that a consistent feature of the prophetologion is its difference from the text of Codex Vaticanus, with variants commonly attributed to Origen's hexapla. According to Zunz, a comparison of the prophetologion with a 3rd century papyrus fragment from Antinoe containing text from Proverbs, Sapientia, and Ecclesiastes shows that the prophetologion text is rooted in an early tradition that differs from the text of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The development of the Middle Byzantine lectionaries took place in an era that Paul Lemerle has extensively described as the first Byzantine humanism. In the 9th century, the veneration of icons was re-established, and a renaissance of classical Greek learning superseded the so-called Dark Ages. After centuries in which very few manuscripts were copied, the transmission of writings from antiquity was systematically resumed. It is well known that we owe the transmission of nearly all classical Greek literature we have to this era's efforts. One crucial element of this process was the invention and systematic adoption of a new script for more efficient book production. The minuscule that you see here side by side with 2 columns from Sinaiticus. Yes, the visual impression immediately is that it is much easier to write such a manuscript in minuscules, and there is an easier way to follow the word divisions the reading of the text by accents and breathings. And one outcome also is a more economical use of parchment and more fluent and faster writing. The strong standardization of the biblical text in Middle Byzantine times was advanced by the transliteration, the metacharacterismos, to which all Greek literature, including the Bible, was subjected. The Merrill considers it appropriate, quote, to compare the invention of literary minuscule with the invention of printing. For answering our guiding question of which factors led from the multiplicity of text forms to uniformity, the transliteration must not be neglected. It is a highly significant factor in the process of standardization because it is likely that after a majuscule had been copied in the new script, subsequent copies were made from the newly produced minuscule exemplar. Moreover, the majuscule exemplar was probably in accord with the text in ecclesiastical use, thus reinforcing the text form familiar to the scribe. The Hebrew text of the Old Testament and the Septuagint, Origen's hexapla. Origen's hexapla provides evidence for early multiformity of the Old Testament tradition and his successful effort to bring the Septuagint text closer to the Hebrew original. By then, between 234 and 250, the first translation of the Hebrew text into Greek, the Septuagint, had been in use for about 500 years and had seen several revisions. Its name refers to the legend told in a document from the 2nd century before Christ, known as the Letter of Aristeas, according to which 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, had produced a Greek translation of the Hebrew Pentateuch, commissioned by the Egyptian king Ptolemaeus II Philadelphos. In modern scholarship, this translation is called the Old Greek, considering that it has its origin in the 3rd century before the Christian era is common ground. Origen arranged the Hebrew text, a transliteration in Greek letters, and 4 Greek translations in 6 columns. The 3rd, 4th, and 6th columns contain the translations by Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, representing earlier attempts to adapt the Greek better to the Hebrew original. The 5th column held the Septuagint text common in Origen's time, complemented by passages found in the Hebrew but not in the Greek. Such additions were tagged by asterisks. Obeli marked passages present in the Greek but not in the Hebrew. This schema shows the general layout of the hexapla 6 columns. For Psalms, Origen included 2 additional translations called the 5th and the 6th, Quinta and Sexta. The Göttingen Septuaginta Unternehmen has begun to collect evidence from patristic literature to fill these columns. It is one significant trait of the Old Testament text in the Middle Byzantine era that the hexaplaric Septuagint became the textual basis of the Prophetologion. The second trait is the remarkable unanimity characterizing the majority of lectionaries and continuous texts of both the Old and the New Testament. To understand the third trait attributed to the Byzantine manuscript tradition of the Bible, we have to turn to another formative factor, the recensions. Recensions and text types. Jerome's Trifaria Varietas. In modern times, the textual scholarship of the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament has been guided by 3 or 4 notes of Jerome, the father of the Latin Bible translation known as the Vulgate. The first is in his prologue to the book of Chronicles. Quote, Alexandria and Egypt praise Hesychius as the creator of their Septuagint. Constantinople, through Antioch, acknowledge the manuscripts of Lucian the Martyr. The provinces between them read Palestinian codices compiled by Origen and propagated by Eusebius and Pamphilus, and the whole world is in a struggle about this threefold variety. Modern Septuagint scholarship followed Jerome in assuming that the original Septuagint had been altered by 3 recensions, edited by Hesychius, Lucian, and Origen. Moreover, although Jerome's threefold variety refers to the Septuagint, his statement was also seen as relevant to the history of the New Testament text. The reason is that Jerome, in the Prefatio ad Damasum to the Vulgate Gospels, written in 383, mentions codices ascribed to Hesychius and Lucian, tampering with the Septuagint and the New Testament texts. I pretermit those codices named after Lucian and Hesychius, to which the perverse aspiration of some people attributes authority. It has neither availed them to amend the Septuagint ad libitum, nor to have amended the New Testament, because Scripture, as translated before into the languages of many nations, shows that what has been added is wrong. This remark and some other notes have been interpreted as key evidence for the theory that Lucian of Antioch and Hesychius of Alexandria had also done recensions of the New Testament, from which the Koine or Byzantine text and the Alexandrian text emerged. Like that of Hesychius, Lucian's work is judged to be an undue alteration of Scripture. However, Lucian's recension is not identified with the Koine here. It is in yet another testimony. In a letter to the Gothic bishops Sunia and Fretela, Jerome answers their question about why his Latin translation of the Psalms differed frequently from the Septuagint as they knew it. Here Jerome appeals to the high quality of Origen's reconstruction of the Septuagint in his hexapla and to its ecclesiastical use. This I point out briefly. There is an edition called Koine that is the commonly propagated by Origen and Eusebius of Caesarea and all Greek commentators, which is now called the Lucianic by most, and another one by the 70 translators, which is also found in the codices of the Hexapla and was faithfully translated into Latin by us. It is the one sung in Jerusalem and in the churches of the East. According to the prologue to the book of Chronicles, Jerome seems to regard it as a fact that in the regions around Constantinople and Antioch, the Septuagint was read in a form said to be produced by Lucian. In the prologue to the Gospels, he says that there are codices ascribed to Lucian and Hesychius by people with evil intent that contain false additions to the Old and New Testament text. In the letter to Sunia and Fretela, he favors the hexaplaric Septuagint over the rest of the Greek versions of the Psalms that are all subsumed under the term koine, which most people ascribe to Lucian. Skepticism against the notion of three recensions of the Bible that takes recourse to Jerome's notes cited above appears well justified. He never focuses on the character and the emergence of the recensions he mentions. He instead seems to refer to them in a way required by the respective argumentation regarding the necessity and quality of his translation into Latin. Returning to the text of the scriptures in the Middle Byzantine era, we discern the text form associated with Antioch and Constantinople, viewed as the result of Lucian's recensional work in Jerome's time, as the third characteristic trait of the Middle Byzantine Septuagint text. The New Testament. In New Testament textual research today, the theory of three early recensions has almost wholly been given up. However, the Trifaria Varietas persisted, mainly as a result of Ernest Colwell's work since the 1960s, referring to three text types instead of recensions. Colwell defines text type as the largest group of sources which can be objectively identified. Like Westcott and Hort, he sees reliable evidence for the existence of three such text types: the Alexandrian, the Western, and the Byzantine. With qualifications, he accepts the Caesarean as a fourth text type. This schema is known as the central thesis of the text type theory, which is propagated still in many primers and handbooks, beginning with Metzger's Text of the New Testament, which appeared in 1964. On the other hand, scholars like David Parker regard this theory as obsolete. In his 2008 Introduction to the New Testament Manuscripts and Their Texts, Parker states, the 18th century text type model was a means by which New Testament textual scholarship could make use of Lachmanianism, even though the texts could not be related in a full Lachmanian stemma. It is now possible to move on, abandoning the concept of the text type and, with the new tools and methods now available, retelling the history of the text. Lachmanianism means the genealogical method applied to the Alexandrian versus the Syrian text by Westcott and Hort, with the sole purpose of overcoming the textus receptus. As a co-editor of the Editio Critica Major, the ECM of the New Testament, I have been involved in developing some of the new tools and methods Parker mentions. First, the Editio Critica Major of the New Testament provides a comprehensive critical apparatus documenting all variants yielded by a full collation of all primary witnesses. As this apparatus lives in a relational database, comparisons and quantitative evaluations can be made to test the text type model. Second, the coherence-based genealogical method, the CBGM, provides a set of tools for evaluating the evidence assembled in the database of all variants and their witnesses. The CBGM extrapolates from the genealogy of variants at all passages of variation to the genealogy of the witnesses containing the variant. The relationship of each witness to all other witnesses can be studied. As a result, the manuscript tradition appears far too complex to be adequately described in terms of 3 or 4 text types. If we abolish the concept of text types in New Testament textual criticism, we can no longer use the term Byzantine text as defined by Metzger, Colwell, and others. It has become obsolete to consider the Byzantine text form as based on the recension prepared near the close of the 3rd century by Lucian of Antioch, as Metzger put it. But many still see it as the last text type standing. Having emerged from the recension hypothesis, however, the term text type should be given up completely in New Testament textual criticism, the more so because a text type is defined by Colwell requires a determination by at least one other text type. The late Byzantine majority text is the result of a process that began together with the transmission itself. Because there was a majority of mainstream text from the beginning. Before the 9th century, however, the majority text was not an entity that could be reliably reconstructed. Because only a few manuscripts of that time have been preserved, and because the entire tradition was less uniform than in late Byzantine times. The 2 stages of textual history, up to and after the 9th century, are separated by 6 to 7 centuries of manuscript copying, in the course of which 3 significant factors drove the development of a smooth and complete koine. Namely, negligence, deorthosis, and contamination. I begin with negligence. The literati in antiquity and in the Middle Ages were well aware that the reproduction of texts by manual copying was prone to error. The classicist Karl Halle has compiled a compendium of error sources mentioned by Jerome, who frequently complained about the inattentiveness of scribes. Jerome said, "Scribunt non quod inveniunt, sed quod intellegunt." They do not write what they find in the exemplar, but what they understand. End quote. Correspondingly, Eduard Schwarz, in the prolegomena to his edition of Eusebius' church history, states that the most frequent cause of error is semi-conscious trivialization. So negligence leads to obvious scribal errors, but also to adopting easier readings of difficult phrases. Deorthosis, methodical correction of the copied manuscript with the exemplar, was an integral part of the copying process. In principle, at least. Obvious scribal errors were removed. It is telling, however, that in a prominent source text, Origen suspects a neglect of correction or a correction executed at the scribe's whim as the cause of variation. Here we have an explanation for the often observed tendency towards a smoother, more common wording, be it linguistically or due to a wording familiar from the scriptures as read during the service. Deorthosis corrects obvious errors, but also replaces difficult with smoother or more common readings. Fourth, contamination. The Greek New Testament has probably the most mixed or contaminated manuscript tradition altogether. Sometimes readings of another manuscript were inserted into the exemplar before copying. Sometimes occasional corrections from a different strand of transmission were noted by readers and crept in if they appeared preferable to a copyist. Suppose the deorthosis of a text was carried out systematically, especially if a comparison of the exemplar with other sources was involved. In that case, we may call the result an addition or a recension. However, Lucian, it appears unlikely to attribute such activities to the efforts of single individuals like Hesychius, Lucian, or Origen. Editing was an integrated part of the copying process in general, and in a way, each manuscript that went through deorthosis is a recension. All three causes of variation, negligence, deorthosis, and contamination, synergize to establish a text smooth and attractive, fitted for cursory perusal or recitation, as Hort characterized the Syrian recension. The final boost towards textual unanimity occurred through the introduction of the minuscule script, which led to an extensive standardization of the Greek New Testament transmission since the 9th century. The Septuagint. Albert Pietersma, in a report about the state of Septuagint research on the verge of the 21st century, reflects on the development of the discipline since Alfred Ralph's 1907 text of the Septuagint Psalter. Ralphs advocated a bipolar model of the textual history of the Septuagint. Quote, Manuscript B, quote from Pietersma. Manuscript B is its one pole with other ancient texts hovering in its vicinity, and the Vulgar text the other. In Ralph's view, all manuscript texts had to be assessed referring to the two poles. In the bipolar model, Manuscript B, the Codex Vaticanus, represents a conservative recension done by Hesychius based on a pre-origenic text, and the Vulgar text is attributed to Lucian's more incisive recension. Ralphs states that the Lucianic Vulgar text is attributed to Lucian's Ralph states that the Lucianic text of the Psalter was corrected towards the Masoretic text and was partly rewritten in Lucian's discretion. In Ralph's view, following his teacher Paul de Lagarde, both recensions were done around 300 and competed against each other. The Lucianic text became widely accepted because it was smooth and closer to the common Koine idiom, hence it is found in the majority of late manuscript witnesses, and this majority indicates the Lucianic text labeled L. It goes without saying that Ralphs preferred B text in approximating the pristine Old Greek. This outline resembles the one promoted in New Testament textual criticism of the era. The analogy is rooted in Jerome's assertion in his letter to Sunia and Fretela, where he contrasts the Koine or Lucianic edition with the authentic Septuagint text found in the Hexapla. Pietersma suggests that a new model is needed to reflect, quote, how the text of the Septuagint developed from its pristine and pre-B origins to its late Byzantine shape, end quote. He continues, rather than the bipolar model, we might better use the metaphor of a tree with a single beginning and subsequent branching out, but with many stunted branches on the lower part of the trunk, some of which fell off. Yet the trunk continued and produced a large crown, even if it be a lopsided one. It is one thing in grouping the textual witnesses to end up with many manuscripts that show relatively little variation among themselves. It is quite another to start with two adversaries that battle for dominance. Evidence evidence from the Judean desert, sometimes in agreement with the L text against B, are explained as Proto-Lucianic or deriving from the Old Greek or differing forms of the Old Greek. The theory of a Proto-Lucianic recension offers a possible solution. Emmanuel Tove suggested that such readings, quote, must probably be ascribed to the changes inserted by the historical Lucian. He also considers the possibility that, quote, the substratum of the Antiochian text contains either the Old Greek translation or any Old Greek translation. Two competing readings may represent two parallel Old Greek traditions. Thus, the Antiochian text would consist of three layers: the Old Greek hexapleuric corrections and corrections by the Antiochian reviser, that is, Lucian. However, distinguishing between the layers is difficult because all kinds of editorial changes are found in all three layers. Be this as it may, today the Lucianic or Antiochian text is no longer equated with the late Byzantine majority text. Tuka Kauhanen, in his 2021 research survey on the Proto-Lucianic and Antiochian text, calls it a distinct textual tradition, quote, discernible in most historical and prophetic books of the Septuagint, end quote, but not in the Pentateuch, according to Wever's edition of 1974. In this view, the Lucianic text is transmitted in a group of only 5 manuscripts labeled L in the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. In comparison with Vaticanus, the Antiochian text features more stylistic Greek and is hence seen as consciously edited. Fernandez Marcos, who published a special edition of the Antiochian text of the first 2 books of Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles, describes the Antiochian text as Septuagintal with, quote, a great number of coincidences with the majority Greek text, in the same current of tradition as the Old Greek, end quote. He believes it is not a new translation of the Hebrew or an Old Greek as if there had been more than one translation, end quote. It was separated from the majority current of Septuagint at an early stage, probably in the 1st century of the Christian era, end quote. It differs considerably from the Septuagint majority text in proper names and shows intriguing links to the Hebrew text. As the Antiochian text is not identifiable in the Pentateuch and in the Book of Psalms, it is possible that it has been diluted into the Byzantine text, just as in the New Testament, says Fernandez Marcos. However, an equation of the Antiochian or Lucianic text with the late Byzantine Koine is maintained no longer. Conclusions. The theory that 3 or 4 recensions or text types shaped the transmission of the Old and New Testament writings in late antiquity appears overly simplistic when considering the complex diversity present in the manuscript traditions. 2. Regarding the Byzantine text as the result of a gradual development is more probable. Recensional activities like Origen's hexaplar reconstruction of the Septuagint and the orthosis procedures played a significant role in shaping the Byzantine text. The orthosis, in combination with contamination, fostered a tendency towards a smooth and clear text. The transliteration into the minuscule script finalized a standardization process that had been ongoing for centuries. Referring to the late majority text as Byzantine is a misnomer because earlier, more diverse text forms were no less Byzantine. Once we abandon the outdated theory of competing early recensions or text types, we should stop limiting the attribute Byzantine to the late majority text. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this clear and rich presentation. Grazie per aver messo in
Thank you so much for highlighting how wrong it is to talk about the rigid textual types, and it is necessary to be cautious because the Byzantine lessons are also in the very ancient text. And so thanks a lot for your presentation.
Facciamo una pausa di un quarto d'ora.
Now we will have a 15-minute break and we will resume at 5:20. Thank you.
secondo. No. Aspetta. Un secondo. Benissimo, riniziamo questa sessione con la lezione di Paolo Fioretti, che insegna presso l'Università di Bari. Ritorniamo quindi al mondo latino. Paolo Fioretti si è occupato a lungo di manoscritti latini, con particolare attenzione alla loro trasmissione e al loro aspetto materiale. E la lezione che ci presenta oggi ha come titolo La Bibbia latina tra antichità tarda e alto medioevo, archeologia del libro, scritture, contesti. Prego Paolo.
Grazie e buon pomeriggio a tutti e a tutte. Data la complessità dei problemi che il tema assegnato mi comporta, ho dovuto operare una scelta drastica. Il mio intervento odierno, pertanto, sarà dedicato alla più antica produzione di manoscritti biblici latini, sulla quale, a differenza di quanto accade per l'Alto Medioevo, mancano lavori di insieme sistematici, funzionali a ricostruire modelli librari, assetti bibliologici, impostazioni grafiche e strutturazioni testuali. Mi fermerò al VI secolo, in corrispondenza di uno snodo fondamentale che prelude alla produzione altomedievale, e rinvio alla versione scritta sia alcune premesse metodologiche, sia un approfondimento.
So we heard it in the first lecture of this afternoon. The oldest attestation kept of biblical manuscripts date back the end of the 3rd century. But what can we assume about what we have lost for the earlier period? So let's make Chisholm a triple jump back in time. So what did the oldest Latin books containing scriptural texts look like from a bibliological, graphic, and textual point of view? As of when is it to be assumed that they began to be produced? What relationship might they have had to the production directly preserved from the late 4th century onward? The dispersal of these materials was dramatic and, as is well known, must be framed in the more general process of loss of the earliest Latin manuscript sources. In the first centuries of the vernacular era, Egypt nevertheless returned fragments of Latin books in the form of roll and codex, but unfortunately none of these turned out to have Christian content. The bulk of the production of the biblical book in Latin language and script, therefore, evidently took place elsewhere, especially in Rome and Italy, but more generally wherever there were Latin speaking Christian groups of some substance. After all, it is well known that even in the communities of the origins, the book was already configured for Christians as an essential tool for prayer. Although not all Christians could read, every Christian regularly listened to reading. Texts were read aloud at worship, commented on during catechesis, exhibited during theological disputes, as well as studied for personal edification. It is in this context, therefore, that one must postulate a book production and circulation that in the early days must have relied to a considerable extent on specimens in the Greek language and script. Although the beginning of a Latin tradition of the Christian book, particularly scripture, did not have to be long in coming. As early as the middle of the 1st century, the spread of Christianity in the Greek or Roman world outside the confines of Judaism had relied on the spread of Greek as the lingua franca of the urban centers of the eastern Mediterranean regions, But as soon as the cult began to proliferate elsewhere as well, the language obstacle became a problem. If initially during ritual scriptures were read aloud in Greek and immediately translated orally into local idioms, gradually written translations developed in languages other than Greek. The earliest of these versions were in Latin. I and We heard of the Vetus Latina today. Scarce but valuable indirect evidence on the lost Latin scriptural specimens comes from a number of paraliterary sources, particularly those that recount episodes related to the persecution of Christians and assertions to which they were subjected, especially for the purpose of seizing books containing the Holy Scriptures. The setting that of North America, but the Christian communities involved are all Latin speaking. In a so-called Acts of the Shilliten Martyrs, written towards the end of the 2nd century, in the Passio Sancti Felici Episcopi dating from the beginning of the 4th, and in the so-called Gesta Apud Xenophilum Acts of a Trial that took place in 320, a book supports in Latin language and script containing Old Testament texts, the Gospels or Paul's epistles are described, sometimes in great detail, at the time of the searches. The books were either hidden in the private homes of some members of the community or were carried by them on their travels inside capsules or other containers, perhaps with the very intention of protecting them from seizures. The terminology they use, the libri membrane codices, is in most cases referable to the codex, to be understood either in a stable structured book arrangement or in mobile units, in loose fascicles, or again in a species of notebooks intended to receive annotations or provisional text. From the Gesta Puzzenophilum rover, it is clear that the Latin Christian of Cirta, the capital of Numidia, had a book patrimony consisting of a considerable number of manuscripts. When the officers arrived at a place where they are wont to meet, having gone to the bibliothekes, they find all the armaria empty, while the final booty of the seizure made as a result of searches at the residences of lectores, subdeacons, and other members of the community amounts in total to no less than 37 books. The absence of directly preserved Latin manuscripts from the period prior to the end of the 1st century induces one to seek a cautious comparison with the coeval Greek materials, which, although also affected by a physiological dynamic of loss, met a different fate since they almost all came from Egypt. While being aware of the limitation that an attempt of this kind must necessarily bear in mind, it must be admitted that for the period under consideration here, from the point of view of written culture, the Greco-Roman world shows itself as a strongly unified system, traversed yet by differences, but also and above all by common tendencies fed by an intense circulation of men, books, and texts. Moreover, Greek Christian books, which, as we have seen, circulated among Latin Christians, um, came from served as a model. It is therefore safe to assume that between the 2nd and early 4th centuries, Latin speaking communities, wherever they were, in addition to systematically resorting to the use of the membranous codex, had to promote a book production largely similar to the coeval Greek production, tending to be in-house, that is self-produced, thus differentiated from the typical of commercial atelier, especially in terms of graphic bibliological settings. The latter had to be rarely valuable and instead more often of medium level, of rather varied consistency, as regards the number of sheets, which is always contained, that is between a minimum of 30 and a maximum of 130, 140, a limit that is rarely exceeded, thus predominantly monotextual from the point of view of content. codices that collected more than one New and Old Testament text are extremely rare, of medium and medium small size, with unstable collation, single column pagination, essentiality of distinctive strategies. Ultimately, books connoted an instrumental function um, uh, by an instrumental function aimed at liturgical celebration, meditation, and spiritual and moral edification. The most significant bibliological differences with respect to Greco Egyptian production had to concern the almost systematic option for parchment and the predominantly square rather than oblong format, consistent with the peculiar aptitude of Roman book craftsmanship. From a graphic point of view, the comparison with Greek materials suggests that for the Latin books too, the contribution of non-professional hands engaged in the attempt to promote posed and tendentially formal adaptation of cursive script, usual or at least generic, that is, not referable to precise types or true canons. So, we should remember that unlike in the Greek world, which is stable from a graphic point of view, in the Roman world, the spread of alphabetism that characterized the empire during the second and third centuries, with a consequent increase in written production and an intense increase in italicity, had produced a radical transformation in the structure of writing, which had shifted from an uppercase to a lowercase system. Among the few surviving evidence of secular Latin books, some appear entirely consistent with the picture outlined so far and seem to suggest to us with vivid efficacy how these Latin scriptural books might likely have looked before the end of the 4th century. A first group, referable to the end of the 3rd or beginning of the 4th, is marked by the use of positive scripts, difficult to classify, which proposed a formalization of the minuscule, not without some uppercase, some majuscule persistence. There belongs, first of all, the fragment of a papyrus codex, particularly significant because it is from the Christian sphere, because it ends on a liturgical text. Square in size, 18 times 18 centimeters with a full page, vergate text. Next to it may be mentioned the membranous codex containing post sententia, almost a square in format, 16 times 14 centimeter, and full page vergate, and the papyrus codex with the Greek Latin version of the Aeneid in the oblong formal typical of study books 36 and 24, paginated in 2 columns. Other useful attestation for the discourse for what we're saying here show a more pronounced connection with the actual cursive minuscule, of which they propose a positive adaptation, such as this papyrus codex with a Greco-Latin version of the Aesopic fables, small in size and square in format. And then the miscellaneous papyrus codex, now in Barcelona, containing Latin and Greek texts, including a Salmus Responsorium, single fascicle, small in size and square format, to be assigned to the 4th century. The circumstance that the testimonies just evoked are all of archaeological provenance, essentially from the Egyptian Kora, makes it difficult to determine on a case-by-case basis whether they originated in Egypt itself or whether they arrived here from other parts of the empire. However, the graphic and bibliological orientation they propose are consistent with what emerges from the literary sources, and mirroring the coeval Greek testimonies remain valid for imagining with a reasonable margin of credibility the tenor the earliest Latin production of scriptural books was. Now let's go from proto-history to history, and so from the hypothesis about gaps in the documentation, which is not a which is not an end in itself, to the possibility of grounding analysis on the oldest direct attestations of Latin biblical books dating to the end of the 4th century, as we said. This century constitutes a decisive watershed in the development in the history of the scriptural codex, both in Greek and Latin words. The reasons are well known, and here I will recall them briefly. And the main step is given by the so-called Edict of Milan in 313, the formal act by which Constantine definitely sanctioned the legitimacy of the history that had by then changed the world, since the enormous spread of Christianity was changing from the foundation, the social and political structure of the empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 helped to determine the beginning of the imperial interference in the church doctrine. The end of hiding and persecution marked for the Christian communities an official recognition of the preeminence they had now firmly established for themselves. However, these considerations, what known to all, alone may not be sufficient to account for the radical transformations that affected the history of the biblical book. We must remember that if the early communities were characterized by horizontal structures led by bishops elected by the communities themselves and by a general attitude of opposition to the imperial power that opposed them and forced them into social marginality, from this era onward, the church became increasingly institutionalized and integrated into the imperial structures of power. After the Council of Nicaea, the clergy were able to benefit from legal and fiscal privileges and began to merge with the elite. In turn, individuals part of the bureaucratic and administrative structures and the ruling class converted by bringing into the church mentalities, attitudes, habits, and practices typical of their own social circles. Bishops assumed the public administrative role and were often appointed and supported directly by the imperial power. The most important episcopal sees became centers of political as well as religious power. The church assumed organizational models and languages proper to the administration by dividing itself into dioceses, attributing to itself honorific titles and distinctive robes, and codifying a proper canon law, configuring itself as an autonomous and hierarchical power capable of profoundly influencing the political and cultural history of Europe, an institution now integrated with the elites and imperial authority. It is within this framework that some unprecedented phenomena in Christian book production, particularly the scriptures, must be interpreted. In both the Greek and Latin worlds, the 4th century saw the sudden appearance of codices that jarred in every respect with the earlier sacred book tradition. Highly formal, these manuscripts, on the one hand, exploited the full technical potential of the codex by enlarging its capacity in order to amalgamate multiple texts into a single book, capsa, or book library, while on the other hand, they stabilized themselves the systematic use of parchment, consistent structural arrangements, and the use of canonized scripture. For the Greek world, let's think of the great codices of the Bible called Pandet, bringing together in a single book the text of the scriptures, such as the Sinaiticus and the Vatican. In the Latin West, however, the phenomenon of the Bible in Pandet is later. But the earliest attestations of biblical manuscripts, in any case, reverberate, albeit in less monumental ways, a new model of the sacred book. The codex known as Bobiensis, witness K of the Vetus Latina, in one of the earliest translations, the so-called African translation, dates from the late 4th century, and is the Oncho, considered to be of probable African origin because of its graphic similarity to an important witness of Cyprian's works. The Turin-based um, in its 38 surviving folios, it contains the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, but originally it was likely to have collected all four Gospels. It is a handy book having dimensions medium small and a square format, 1916. The text is arranged full page, a puncture in the center of the writing mirror guided the rifling in accordance with a typically Latin craftsmanship practice. As far as can be restructured, its fascicles are mostly quaternions, albeit with some irregularities. The text flows without divisions into verses or chapters, but the transition from one gospel to the next is marked by full-page titles in black and red ink, in a manner typical of coeval secular books of value. The current titles in the upper margin of the pages emblematically bear in the same Oncho script used for the text a transliteration from the Greek Evangelion Katamarkon and thus betray a strong link to the Greek model of the text. The Codex Bobiensis attests to an undoubted qualitative leap, as evidenced by the now almost completed stabilization of craftsmanship practices of manufacture, the good quality of the parchment, the increased capacity that allows for the amalgamation of the four Gospels, and of course the use of a highly formal and normative script such as Oncho, here um, penned with a broad form which in a narrow space of the graphic mirror contains a rather sequence of words. In other ways, it seems in some ways to repropose certain structural choices that, as we have seen, were to connote production in the earlier period. I'm thinking especially of the size and format of the sheets as well as the absolute sobriety of the presentation of the text. Ultimately, although in the wake of tradition, the Bobiensis shows the entry in the production practices of the Christian book of graphic and craft skills that until then had been typical of the professional circuit of the commercial sphere. The transition to a new phase of the scriptural book is made even more evident by another important witness of the Vetus Latina that we have already described, the so-called Vercellensis Codex of the Gospel, tradition attributed to the patronage of Eusebius of Vercelli, who died around 371.
Tutta evidenza.
The codex can be clearly traced to a high level of book craftsmanship, no doubt the work of professionals. Today, it retains just over 300 folios, but it too has lost a substantial portion. And unlike the Bobiensis, the Vercellensis has an oblong format of the folios, approximately 25 by 16 centimeter, with the text paginated in two narrow columns. The fascicles are quaternion with the flesh side on the outside, according to a craftsmanship mode typical of the Greek East. Liturgical notes penned in lowercase cursive in the margins, referable to the 7th century, attest to a continuity of use in solemn ceremonies. Not only liturgical, as the book must soon have become a venerable relic, to the extent that its deterioration has also been referred to continuous and intensive use. Also, commissioned from high-level craft workshops are two other ancient witnesses to the sculptures in the Vetus version, which, among other things, testify to the existence of forms of collaboration and coordination between copyist and illuminator or rubricator. The so-called Itala of Quedlinburg is the oldest illustrated biblical manuscript that has been preserved, albeit in fragments, dating from the turn of the 4th to the 5th century and written in an oncho of large form on two columns in sheets of large square format, 31 by 27. The codex features full-page miniatures that make it a cornerstone of late antique art history. Still visible today, penned in lowercase cursive, are some of the work instructions left by the copyist to the illuminator. That secular workshops were now also in the habit of setting up scripture codices of absolute formal merit through apparatus books is also proven by the so-called Palatine Codex of the Gospels, now preserved between Trent, Dublin, and London, a sumptuous purple manuscript penned in onshaw with gold and silver inks. Referred to the 5th century, it was produced in North Africa, or it seems more likely in Italy, perhaps Ravenna, from an antigraph bearing the African Gospel Recensio. In it, a scribe artist, whose hand is clearly distinguishable from that of the copyist, flanks the letter by making the incipit lines of the Gospels of John and Luke in gold. The format is oblong, with 2 columns per page, while the collation is in quaternions. The full page titles are in rustic capital in alternating colors, and again, marginal annotations related to the liturgical use of the codex are legible in lowercase, onshaw, and semi-onshaw. In the light of what has been observed so far, it seems clear that the qualitative leap in the production of sacred texts witnessed towards the end of the 4th century should not be interpreted as a progressive evolution developed within the primitive Christian book production, but as the sudden entry of the sacred codex into the sphere of the typical modes of commercial book production, especially of value. By this time, the workshops had expanded their repertoire to meet the unprecedented demand for scriptural books that came not only from their traditional patrons, that is, from the very members of the ruling class that by then had integrated ecclesiastical institutions into systems of power, but also from the highest hierarchies of the church. It was in these contexts that high-profile craft skills for the first time allowed the Christian Codex to make a leap from more or less modest specimens in current use, marked, as you have seen, by unstable graphic features and materials, to structurally and aesthetically normalized products. In this perspective, the use of parchment, standardized formats, constant collating, and more rigorous page organization, as well as the systematic adoption of normative scripts, should be then considered. Consider, moreover, that the normalization of the valuable sacred codex gave the impetus to experiences of teaching normative scripts that were also active outside professional workshops, that is, at ecclesiastical seats and monastic foundations. These are experiences that seem to anticipate the graphic schools that would be active at the most important scriptoria of the early Middle Ages. Indeed, it is to be assumed that a circulation of both high-quality book specimens and craftsmen from secular workshops promoted the codex model that was produced there at certain Christian establishments, especially where adequate financial resources could be counted on that would have enabled the preparation of valuable biblical specimens. At this point, it is worth noting that the trend that characterized the earliest production of Christian books, aimed at the setting up of instrumental use specimens of medium quality, did not undergo a caesura, but experienced a continuation, especially in the smaller Christian communities that, compared to the great centers of ecclesiastical and later even monastic power, remained marginal. And it remained alive, even for books that were indeed scriptural in content, but continued to serve a practical function, such as, for example, text study. Materials of this tenor are highly likely to have been largely lost, not easily falling within the traditional dynamics of library preservation in the long run. What is important to note here, however, is that the reference model for transcribing biblical manuscripts had changed by then, to the point that the onshul remained the preferred script. Again, a parallel arises with what was happening in the Greek world, where the tradition of the sacred book was accompanied almost steadily by the use of biblical capitals. That middle quality tradition, in short, as far as the surviving documentation allows us to observe, no longer resorted to generic, albeit tendentially formal graphic solutions or to adaptations of cursive and informal scripts. If anything, it could express less accurate and formal levels of the same onshul. Dating back to the 6th century, in fact, are some evidences of an onshul of average quality, albeit within the limits of a tendency toward formality that is almost inherent in it. These are clearly the fruit of the work of non-professional hands, but nonetheless educated to produce such writing, perhaps in ecclesiastical or monastic contexts. See what survives of 3 copies of the Old Testament, probably of Italian production, in some sheets now in Verona, Vienna, and Orleans, respectively, and a Turin Codex of the Gospels destroyed in the 1904 fire. Alternatively, for biblical manuscripts of a lower level, because of instrumental use, the so-called semi-onshul could be employed. Though is not the best expression we may use, usually reserved for the transcription of minor Christian texts, such as patristic works, exegetical works, acts of councils, and others. The use of the semi-onshul in scriptural codices is rather rare, but it is nevertheless attested and must be interpreted from time to understand the reasons that may have been behind it. As an example, attention may be drawn to Sangalensis 1395, dating from the early 5th century, which is considered among the oldest witnesses to the Gospels in the Vulgate by Jerome, who revised the circulating Latin translations. The codex may have been exemplified on the basis of an antigraph from circles close to Jerome itself, or at least in which there was familiarity with Greek codices. The final title of Matthew and the initial title of Mark are closed by a decoration reminiscent of the so-called pile, a motif inspired by the architectural element of a door frame, widespread in Greek Byzantine manuscripts to enhance with both a decorative and distinctive function the beginning of a section of text, and whose prodromes have been effectively identified by Daniele Bianconi in late antique manuscripts, including a well-known 5th century Alexandrian Bible Codex. About 110 sheets survive of the Sangalensis, tending to a square format, 23 by 18, with text arranged in 2 columns. The codex is structured in quaternions composed of parchment that tends to be of good quality, but not always uniform. A number of marginalia with Latin and Greek variants refer to the same copyist. One is likely before a copy intended for the study of the text of the Gospels, thus connoted by an instrumental function, which is shown to be of fairly good craftsmanship, and for the arrangement of which the high model of the scriptural codex in onshul was imitated. That the use of the semi-onshul in this case was a precise choice and not a circumstance forced upon us by, for example, an unfamiliarity with the onshul, is proven by the fact that the letter is employed in a distinctive function for the titles. As mentioned, however, the history of the Latin biblical book is linked to that of the onshul. The almost systematic option for the script, attested since the end of the 4th century, that is, from its earliest stages, and continued during the early Middle Ages until the Carolingian Age, should not necessarily lead to the assumption that it originated in Christian contexts. just as had happened 2 centuries earlier to the biblical uppercase. Its Greek counterpart, the onshore, may have come to light in the context of commercial book production.
Dall'inizio anche per testi profani.
It is a fact that it was also used from the beginning for secular texts, as shown, for example, by the Livy preserved between the Vatican Library and the Capitolary in Verona. It is in these professional areas of book production that, and in the choices made, of course, that the dynamics of the relationship between the ancient tradition of the capital, now detached from a graphic culture diffusely based on the minuscule, and the model of formal writing offered by the onshore, which from an alphabetical point of view merges the old with the new in an effective synthesis, must be sought. Ultimately, it could be argued that just as the Codex did not originate within Christianity, but received a decisive push from it for its dissemination, so the onshore arose in secular and professional circles, but adopted immediately by Christians for sacred texts, became its emblem to the point that the process of sacralization that involved it and that brought it to an identification with the divine message itself takes place parallel to the well-known process of sacralization that the scriptural codex experienced between the 5th and 6th century. To understand even more effectively how profoundly late antiquity influenced the early medieval production of manuscripts with sacred content, one must consider one of the most important junctures in the history of the Latin biblical book. I have to go back to the previous paths already introduced. Vivarium, founded by Cassiodorus after 554 near Squillace in Calabria, a monastic community certainly dedicated to a Christian spiritual life, but also based on an entirely librarian and philological conception of culture. Here, the antiquari, or librari, played a crucial role, so much so that Cassiodorus devotes much of a paragraph of Book 1 of the Institutiones to them, loading their role with strong meanings and providing precise indications on how to transcribe and how to pay attention to respect for sacred texts. But more generally, the whole work denotes a marked sensitivity on the part of the author to issues affecting the bibliological, graphic, and textual arrangement of the manuscripts that were produced, read, studied, and preserved in Vivarium. Being a true Christian school, the biblical text and its material vehicles are the subject of certain clarifications that are of extreme interest and that in some cases, thanks to the auctoritas of those who set them out and can quickly put them into practice, influenced the subsequent production of the scriptural book. In the introduction, Cassiodorus employs terminology that explicitly recalls practices of philological work, adapting them to the sacred text. Moreover, he refers to the model of Jerome, who, impressed by the simplicitas of the brothers, whose education evidently lacked basic skills for a correct approach to the texts, had made in his versions of the Bible a series of distinctions by pagination, percola et commata, and punctuation marks. Cassiodorus reveals, among other things, that he had Vivarium set up 3 different editions of the Bible. A version of the Vetus in 9 codices, which he wished to be accompanied by paratexts such as introductions and commentaries, also in Latin. A second edition with Jerome's Vulgate, called Pandette, thus collected in a single codex that had been penned minutiore manu in 53 senions, thus 636 sheets, total, so that, Cassiodorus points out, the compact density of the writing could contract what a copious amount of text developed. A third edition, with the hexapla version edited by Jerome in a Grandiore Codex, composed of 95 quaternions, thus 760 folios, and Littera Clariore Conscripto, in obvious antithesis with the Codex Vergato Minutiore Manu. In these, which are the first explicit attestations for the Latin West of editions of the biblical books in a single volume, we can observe the great variety of arrangement of the Holy Scriptures that must have connoted the period under consideration here, with graphic and bibliological solutions that evidently subtend different functions, a variety of which we too often have no direct perception because of the fragmentary state with which many biblical witnesses of late antiquity have come down to us. Indeed, the care with which Cassiodorus takes to describe in detail certain material aspects of these editions, in addition to being a clear indication of considerable technical awareness, serves to make explicit the connection between a specific book type and the function it fulfilled. The reference to the nature of the fascicles, for example, is not accidental. For the copying of the Vulgate in a single codex, that they evidently wanted to have a book that was easy. So an effort was made to constrain the bulk of the text in an artifact of relatively small size, either by reducing the module of the writing, and perhaps we can imagine that, even by choosing a graphic type that lent itself well to the operation, such as, for example, the semi-uncial, and by opting for the Senian, which allowed for an overall reduction in the number of fascicles and, consequently, the overall thickness of the codex. The edition with the hexapla version, on the other hand, was presented as an apparatus artifact of considerable size and penned in an airy script with a large form, almost certainly an uncial. Unfortunately, none of the biblical manuscripts preserved in vivariums armaria have come down to us, but a concrete reflection of what the Cassiodorian Codex Grandior may have looked like is offered by one of the oldest surviving Latin Bibles in Pandet. Probably we do not have any of the manuscripts that we had. However, we have the famous Codex Amiatinus offered today. This is the Codex Amiatinus, as I was saying. Now in Florence, its history is now firmly reconstructed. As part of the dispersion of the Vivarian library that must have occurred after Cassiodorus' demise, the Codex Grandior came into the hands of Abbot Benedict Biscop, who took it with him, along with other codices, to Northumbria, where it founded the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow. Here, Abbot Silfrid, who succeeded Benedict Biscop, arranged for tres pandectes nove translationes to be set up precisely on the model of Cassiodorus' Codex Grandior. 2 of the 3 copies are recognizable in some fragments, while the third can be identified with the Amiatinus. In 716, Abbot Silfrid left for Rome, taking it with him with the intention of giving it to the Pope, but he died on the way. Physical characteristics very plausibly reflect the appearance that must have connoted the Cassiodorian antograph, and not surprisingly, are perfectly consistent with what is described in the Institutiones, consisting of more than 1,030 sheets. The codex is large and oblong in format, 50 by 34, paginated in 2 columns of 44 or 45 lines each, structured in quaternions, usually bearing a cross in the upper left-hand corner of the first page. Penned obviously in uncial by 7 hands. It has the current titles in rustic capital and framed by decorative leaflets. I've almost finished. The modals are both Latin and Greek. The text is organized by colla and commata, punctuated in its sections by an essential but effective system of punctuation and blank spaces. I will skip this part. Let's focus now on what we mentioned before. That is the initial image of this book. Here we have Ezra writing on a codex following the figurative model of the evangelists. In this scene, actually, Ezra is a stand-in for Cassiodorus himself, seated before an armarium containing the 9 codices of his Vetus. Jean Ribaumont is credited with the idea that the model for this scene, with the open armarium and the books resting on the shelves, may have come to Cassiodorus from the Ravenna mosaic of Galla Placidia. Dating from the first half of the 5th century, which Cassiodorus must have been well acquainted with, each of the backs of the 9 codices bears a title, no longer legible to the naked eye, bearing the contents of each. The order of the biblical books is roughly that attributed to Augustine. In the Institutiones, in front of the scribe, there is a work table with a double inkwell filled with red and blue, a scribe rubricator. Cassiodorus is using red for stressing some marginal paratext, as he said. On the ground, some other tools that realistically connote the space and work of the copyist, which Cassiodorus himself, as we have seen, held in the highest regard as the fundamental focus of the activity, exegetical and prayerful, that took place at Vivarium. Among the instruments, another book, closed, in which we wanted to see the Codex Minutiorimanus Scriptus, with Jerome's Vulgate, present in the scene, but in second order, to the 9 codices of the Armarium, as if to visually reflect the hierarchy of importance that emerged from the Institutiones, as the top of which is still the Verus. Finally, in the hands of Cassiodorus Scriba, would appear the Codex Grandior, containing the revision made by Jerome itself on the critical Greek text established by Origen. The whole scene, then, is an extraordinary programmatic manifesto that translates into images the ideal construction of biblical knowledge embodied in Vivarium and destined to confirm in textual choices, bibliological arrangements, and graphic imprint the manuscript tradition of the Holy Scriptures throughout the entirely early Middle Ages. But this is another story. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Bellissimo, molto chiara.
Beautiful lecture. Thank you so much. So now we can start our discussion. So I'd like to call here Professor Cremascoli.
Sì, sì. Sì, ma intanto iniziamo con te, prego. Benissimo. Iniziamo la discussione sulla prima lezione.
So we can start a discussion on the first lecture by Giuseppe Cremascoli, Letter and Allegory, having access to the Invisibilia Dei. Do you have any observations?
Di alzare la mano e arriverà.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand and Roberto Relli will get you the microphone. So please say your name before asking your question. Shall I go to my place because there's nobody for me? But your lecture was so rich and so clear that you have no questions, no doubts. So maybe if there are no questions, I will start. Okay, so I have one question for you. So Giuseppe, this morning you spoke about the different authors and their interpretation, exegetic and literal interpretation. So my question is about the existence of exegetic schools. What do we know about this? Do we have information about these schools? Well, the question is very interesting. Rather than the individual exegetes, the establishment of schools, institutions, where the objective was to interpret the Bible. So I believe that talking about school institutions, just as we define them, such as the I don't know, the University of Engineering in Milan, doesn't make any sense at the time. But we must never forget that monastic schools, cathedral schools, and then if we go over the centuries, universities, the biblical reader is a fundamental person because Venerable Bede stated that he spent all his life after being placed in a monastery for at 7 years old. Well, he lived there, he was happy, and he said he spent his life by praying, studying, and teaching. But we know that his teaching was on biblical text and biblical content. And so that world went around the biblical message. So I realized that after many centuries, very interesting lectures that I've listened to today, um, give attention to the book as such, the establishment, dissemination of books. I'm not saying regardless of the content, because we know that it's a biblical text, that it was built in such a way and transmitted in a specific way. But to me, it is interesting to see how the focus of our attention, of the attention, of what I said in my speech was on the content. And on the contrary, it is part of the history of culture, and this is what has been done in the structuring of this conference to focus our attention on the concrete example or aspects, on the real aspects operated in the history of the world. So things change all the time. Who knows how they will change when the future comes? Thank you. Do you have other questions for Professor Crimascoli? Doubts? Okay, so we can move on. So you please come here. You can sit wherever you want.
Avete delle domande?
Do you have questions on from the Vetus Latinum to the Vulgate transition in the manuscripts of the Latin Bible? You have any questions? Curiosity? Also, the scholarship holders. We have one question.
Was at least easy to read. We have not begun to read from grammar school the Scriptio Continua. Who knows what that was? But are the references to the Percola et Comata being very useful for public reading of the scriptures specifically? We were chanted to specific formulae, or is that just supposed that it would make it easier to prepare a reading of the scripture, chanting of it in public?
I think if you look at the text of Jerome's prefaces to Isaiah and Ezekiel, I don't think there's a context of public reading. I think it's a context of reading in general. That Jerome doesn't say a lot about the purpose of his revision. Therefore, we have to assume that any revised text of the Bible is a text which is devised to encompass all of the possible uses of the Bible, whether that's liturgical, personal, meditative, and so on and so forth. And I suspect that the reason that Percola et Comata is used in the wisdom books, in the prophetic books, is actually a way of highlighting the literary structure. You know, the sort of the A and the B. The matching thoughts on both sides. And so there's almost an exegetical purpose to it, I think, rather than a liturgical purpose, that you see here's the first half, here's the second half. There is this thought structure, notably, of course, in texts which derive from Hebrew literature rather than from Greek. And I think that's probably what Jerome is wanting to bring out there. Of course, it would work well for the liturgy, but I think it works well in terms of exegetical understanding too.
Thank you. And again, about Comata, this kind of arrangement is typical of bilingual manuscripts too, because we have manuscripts of the Vetus Latina, like Codex Carolinus and Gixensis, Gothic and Latin, and they are arranged per collecomata. So.
Well, they're arranged in different ways. I mean, I don't want to anticipate any paper that we have on bilingual manuscripts, but there are some bilingual manuscripts, not just biblical ones, but others, which is almost... no more questions. Which is almost word for word. And others, if you think Codex Bezae of the Bible, has much longer lines and is more in the sense line format. So obviously there's that connection. And Eleanor Dickey has written wonderful articles about how columnar translation, even if it's sort of one or two words in each column, serves a didactic purpose in enabling people to connect to the languages. So in that case, it's not even per color comata, it's per verbal mit verbal in that respect. So I mean, bilingual manuscripts are a separate case in point. But Jerome doesn't mention that in terms of setting it out. I mean, this was something I think particularly he wanted to do from a Latin purpose. But yes, I mean, there's a, well, I don't know, I mean, it's potentially a similar function.
Altre domande, osservazioni?
Do you have other questions?
Alzata. Prego il nome.
Your name, please.
Your presentation. I have a question because I don't remember which manuscripts specifically. You mentioned that one book, I think it's Matthew, that was not in the same tradition than the other one. I think Matthew was in the Vetus Latina, and the rest of the manuscript is in the Vulgate. Do this kind of special configuration, I would say, appear a few times, or is it a total exception?
No, it's not a total exception. The manuscript which I was referring to was Codex Sangermanensis, which is Paris Bibliothèque Nationale 11553, I think. So that was the Pandect, which potentially goes back to the 5th century, 5th or 7th century, but this is the 9th century copy. It's by no means unique. The other famous example is a much later manuscript, the 13th or 14th century Codex Gigas, which is very well known for its picture of the devil and so on, and that has Old Latin text in Acts and the Catholic epistles and Revelation, but it has a good Vulgate text in the rest of the New Testament, in most of the Old Testament, but not all books. So when pandects are put together, they are put together from a variety of sources. And what's unusual in San Germanensis is one gospel is Old Latin and the other gospels are Vulgate. Now you would expect that if we have the standard divisions of the New Testament, which Dr. Wachtel talked about, of Gospels, letters, prax apostoloi, and so on, and the groups of the Old Testament into the Heptatuke, the prophets, and so on, you would expect a consistency within those. So what's unexpected is the idea that you have Matthew in a pandect, but as Old Latin. But if you were just within a gospel book, even that could have been assembled from different translations. You simply have a copy of Matthew circulating, and later on, Vulgate versions of Luke, Mark, and John are added to turn a single book into a book of the four gospels. Then if that is integrated into a pandect, these peculiarities become fossilized. So it's that block mixture, but it's the same sort of model as the word-by-word fossils in a mixed text, where you still get a few remnants of the lexicon of the early translation, but at the same time, the majority of the text matches the Vulgate. So it just goes to show that I said whenever you create a new edition, you might have new paratextual material, you might have new titles, new capitula, and so on. Equally, when you put a pandect together, every time you put together the new pandect, if you assemble it from its constituent parts, that creates a unique combination. And if we had more evidence, and I don't know the amount of work that's been done, because we have so few early pandects remaining, but perhaps in Tours, if you look at the Tironian pandect and you try to plot a course as to what the sources, what the original manuscripts were from which these pandects were put together, whether pandects were copied as pandects or whether you have open fascicles going round in the scriptorium to mass produce these things, that might give you a sense of how the books have been put together. But for the early pandects, we don't have any evidence that even Amiatinus and its sister manuscripts were then later used as exemplars for copying, that they seem to be one-off.
Altre domande?
Do you have other questions? Curiosity? Remarks? What about the students, the scholarship holders? Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, please come here. Okay, no further questions. Thank you, Hugh. And now we can move on and discuss the lecture by Professor Wachtel, the Byzantine text. Once again, do you have questions?
Please.
Yes, I'm Adam Cohen from the University of Toronto. Thank you very much for your presentation. At the end, you suggest that this term, the Byzantine type, is not very useful because it doesn't represent the complexity of the situation. I don't recall, do you have a recommendation for some other term that we might use so that when we talk about this, we all know what we're referring to?
Yes, we might add another attribute, namely late Byzantine majority text. And it is a simplification to call, or it is a simplification that is rooted in the recension hypothesis, that the late Byzantine text is called, yes, simply Byzantine. And it carries a value judgment, which we should get rid of to be more sensible for the actual evidence we see in the manuscript, which is much more diverse than our predecessors thought.
So I'm not trying to be lighthearted about this, but I hope you will understand my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, so if we talk about a late Byzantine majority text, we should not fall into the mistake of thinking that there's an early Byzantine majority text or a late Byzantine minority text. I just want to be clear in my own mind what we can say and what we can't say.
Yes. The essential point is that we should not try to structure the very complex manuscript tradition by assigning each and every manuscript to one of these three categories. Because that opens our mind for the complexity that we actually see in the manuscript tradition. That is the basic point. All this is Byzantine. And Byzantine is a very long phase of the history of transmission.
Thank you. Viktor Golinetz, Hochschule für jüdische Studien, the Center for Jewish Studies in Heidelberg. It's just a comment to the question by Adam Cohen and a comment to the answer by Klaus Wachtel. So it's important to the notion of the variety of the text form within the manuscripts, even from the same tradition, so to say, is very important. And I'm coming from the Jewish studies. Just want to give another hint on it from the perspective of Hebrew manuscripts. People also used to use the term textus receptus in connection to the specific type of Hebrew manuscripts, like the Masoretic textus receptus text, which is, of course, is a misnomer taken from the New Testamental studies. But besides this, when they speak about the Masoretic text type or Masoretic text, we are also not precise enough. And I think this is the parallel to what we may see in New Testamental studies, because we have several types of Masoretic texts. We have Tiberian texts, Masoretic texts, we have Babylonian texts and Palestinian texts. And within all these traditions, there are still more varieties and other subtypes. And for these reasons, it's, I think, important to speak about Masoretic texts for the Hebrew tradition, and also not to rely just on a relatively late designation like textus receptus or Oriental text or European text. Some people also speak about Ashkenazic text, etc. So it's just a comment from the perspective of Jewish studies.
Sei sicuro che sia per questa relazione?
Are you sure it's for this lecture? Okay, so no, it's not for this lecture.
Altre domande?
Do you have other questions, remarks?
Va bene, se non ci sono...
Okay, so if there are no further questions, thank you. And we can proceed with the discussion on the lecture by Paolo Fioretti. Latin Bible between late antiquity and early Middle Ages, archaeology of the book, scriptures and context. So we have a first question Professor Cristiani, the senatorial culture of the imperial culture is also a philological culture that pays attention to editions, and so Cassiodorus brings this education in a Christian culture. Yes, rather than a question, it's a contribution to our reflection. I fully agree. Yes, thank you for this remark. Do we have questions? Massimiliano Bassetti. Yes, I just want to say thank you for the wonderful work you've done. And I have some questions that I like, some things that I'd like to discuss with you, or even later we can talk. First of all, Amiatinus. So I'd like to know what you think about the hypothesis that the exemplary of the Amiatinus, from which it was copied, can be the code from which the fragment used as um, the charter of a codex today. From the point of view of contents, I believe it fully matches. Also from the point of view of the version, the graphic quality, so it is a product which is probably a Roman product, which is connected to that transmission of the Amiatinus, and might recall a Roman um, background. The second question, as we know, the history of Amiatinus is told by Bede by an anonymous Abadum, Vida Badum. So the code comes to Rome um, because some people bring it to Gregorius. So he thanks for this gift, and then everybody wonders how can this code have arrived. So someone tried um, to say who could be the abbots through that. And the other question I have: what do you think about the first fascicle of the Codex Amiatinus that was still discussed without finding a solution? It is a calque of the original. Is it a calque of the original? It is a fragment of the original. It is something which comes from the culture of Rome. And I'm sorry, maybe it's too long. My question is too long, but thank you. We can talk later also. Thank you, Massimiliano. While your remarks show that you should have given this lecture because you are an expert in the field. Well, very simple way, I can say that I have the same impressions as you have on the fragment. Haven't made more considerations, but yes, I can say yes. The answer can be yes about the events which made the manuscript arrive there. Well, no, I wouldn't say anything. In my opinion, there are no reasons. What was able to be built on the journey of this manuscript is already a lot, and it's already rare for the time to have so many details. The fascicle, the initial fascicle of the Amiatinus. No, I don't think it is the fascicle that was physically retrieved from the model. I believe it is a similar fascicle with some adjustments, but it's a similar one. Something I'm very interested in, on the contrary, is that the structure of the Amiatinus shows that the code was not thought of and created in a single block, but at least three blocks: the Old Testament divided in two parts, and the New Testament. And the initial fascicle, a comparison comes to my mind, which can really explained is the initial fascicle as is like a separate fascicle, autonomous fascicle which accompany the monumental edition, because very often when the sources talk about codex, not necessarily it means that they are referring to a single object in the code, in the form of the code, but a code which can also be an edition, and a code which could also be physically structured in separate parts. And in my opinion, that fascicle is a fascicle which accompanies the three blocks, just like the fascicle of Dioscuri of Venia was accompanying uh, the main fascicle. So I believe it is similar, but it was produced with the others. So thank you for your remarks and suggestions. So, excuse me, if I have well understood, it was um, divided in three parts. We don't know. There are some internal clues which make us believe that um, that the binding in a single structure took place later. But the moment when this similar copy was created in a monastery, and I wonder whether the edition of Cassiodorus was structured in the same way, because in Cassiodorus we don't have any evidence that it was a single physical structure bound together. Uh, uh, so it was divided in three parts, three books, which were together with a separate little fascicle which contained materials which are a kind of paratext, so a kind of accessus to the biblical text. So a paratext, iconographic paratext, and graphic text. Well, bringing three books rather than one, yes, but uh, carrying 30 kilos, well, the idea that they were carrying 30 kilos is an idea that I avoid, because these are reference copies. Cassiodorus, for example, about the edition in nine codexes. It says they are there, and also on another edition, he said that they are there in that library. If you want to consult them, you can go there. So this is the different. This is the different function: the codex grandior and minutiores manus conscriptus. So physiognomy and physics, which have different purposes, different functions, and so monumental editions could be structured in a different way than what we see today. As archaeologists, we have to make an effort and see how such a book evolved. So the way we see it today in the library is the arrival, uh, but not the starting point of the book. Do you have other questions? Your name, please.
Massimo Bernabò.
Massimo Bernabò. I deal with Greek manuscripts. I'm curious about one thing in particular, that is Cassiodorus in Opteteucum. The partition for him of the Bible is the Optateuch. Instead, in the Greek word, the word Otateuko is spread. I mean, this collection of the first 8 texts is quite common. Also in the commentary, there are questions on it. On the Otateuko or Optateucus. There's a commentary on the Optateuchus, some others also. In the Western world, I think that we do not have these love, I would say, for the first 8 books as an entity. This is true, absolutely true. Suffice to see the Codex Latin Antiquaris to understand that it's true. And the reason, well, honestly, I don't know the reason. But actually, that's correct. And now I'm going back with my mind to the census I did in this work. And probably this is something that we do not know, and probably is not by chance. And we should wonder why, especially in the early Middle Ages, there was this lack of attention towards this part. I couldn't answer, actually, honestly. But your question is interesting. Probably somebody here may give you an answer, may have some ideas. I don't know. However, it is very interesting, yes. I'll think about it. Thank you. May I give a suggestion? Well, the Optateuchus was the part that for the first chapters of Genesis, and generally speaking, for the whole narrative part, also linked to the difficulties that Professor Cremascoli mentioned, Stermini, for instance, and so on. This was a part that when we doubt on the possibility of interpreting from an allegorical point of view the narrative part, we have difficulties. So I think that this is what we could say. This is how we could explain that. Instead, Psalms, Sapientiali, these are the basis of spirituality. This is not a term I love, but actually this is how it is. Well, thank you, Professor Brancivalli. Some other remarks?
Hugh? Ah, due mani alzate.
Hugh Houghton, Birmingham. Thank you for your paper. It was wonderful to see how, even looking at often the same documents, there's so much that can be said from a different perspective. And I wanted to ask you about one point of overlap. When you were observing the hand, the scribal quality of some of the manuscripts, and you noted that Codex Virtulensis is clearly, you said the work of professionals, it's somebody who has been trained in multiple scripts. Does that, in your view, discount the likelihood that it was written by Eusebius himself? What do you think in terms of the scribes of Latin Christian manuscripts, whether they were themselves members of Christian communities versus whether Latin Christian books might have been copied by secular scriptoria?
Sì, grazie. Penso che
I think that these environments of the production of the professional book of late antiquity, especially between the end of the 4th, beginning of 5th centuries, it's true. In this context, normally, we refer these contexts to some contexts that are not sacred, they are profane. But actually, this belongs to the profane and Christian culture. And sometimes the context, the environments are the same. And in the houses of aristocrats, sometimes we may find in their libraries classic texts, but also Christian texts. And I think that the answer is trivial. I think that there's an osmosis of environments and context, and this is what is peculiar in these centuries. and also the peculiar aspect of these transformations of the system of production of the book. And this is the right key for interpreting these facts, not thinking according to categories, separating profane contexts and sacred Christian context, because very often it's like the same circles, the same, I would say, the same environments, the same contexts, making use of these tools for analyzing and approaching texts, classical texts and Christian texts. So the atelier, which are the reference of these things, adapt to it and start to produce, for example, the Ravennati examples, producing profane manuscripts and Christian manuscripts. At the same time, working with the rustic capital and with the onshore, because we have two different statuses, two different stories and functions. But now this is how the word is. It's like all the same thing. Thank you. Another question. Should I stand up? First of all, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Mattia Viti from the University of Genoa. I will refer to myself. I beg your pardon. This is my case study on the Optateuchus, because in the inventory at the end of the 9th century, we talk about an heptateuch or heptatic. And this is a reference to the church where we describe the church and the assets of the church. I had difficulties in interpreting this because I see that there's an unicum and I had no other references on this. And it seemed weird to me. I was thinking of a possible link with Anglo-Saxon England, but actually I don't know what to think about it. If this is also true for Optateuchus, probably there's a common side. I don't know. This is to say that this is an inventory that has no consequences. We had nothing stored, I would say. Then the word volumen and the parchment rolls. What is this indicating? I'm thinking of a parchment. I don't know. This was my question to clarify the word volumen. Yes, thank you. Well, as for the first question, I wanted to give a contribution to the Optateuchus question, and I couldn't. And these question is like the same, follows the previous one, so I couldn't answer. The date is at the end of the 9th century. Okay, so that's interesting. Thank you. It's out of mic. Unfortunately, we cannot hear what they're saying. An inventory of codices also, and nothing is said about it. Just this remark on the content. Mic, please, or we cannot translate. So the two questions are interlinked. As for the volumen, we have to refer to Gregory the Great. Volumen means basically it's a synonym of book. No connections with the tradition of volumina in the form of a roll. That's clear. That's very clear. So the semantic evolution of the term already at the time of Gregory the Great can be considered as it is. Thank you. Any other questions? Questions? Okay, so I think that we can conclude this interesting day. I would like to thank all the speakers. I would like to thank all of you attending for this discussion. We will be here at 9 tomorrow morning, here as well. Enjoy your dinner. See you tomorrow.